So I had a professional setback this week, and big deal. It happens to everybody. Everybody who works hard, everybody who knows what it means to labor in a particular field or calling or vocation. We all know what it feels like to have professional setbacks. Things don't always work out as we planned. We deal with disappointment in life all the time, and we move on. It's no big deal. That's what life is about. Life is primarily a series of trials and challenges in which perseverance is required. And success, when it comes in life, is precious and rare, and most of it is just the ability to cope with a series of disappointments in our professional or personal or spiritual lives. We experience setbacks. So here's what happened to me this week. I was primed to have the best writing year of my whole life. This was the year, 2018. I had a number of projects that were successful for me. My book on joy came out earlier, I guess it was in May. I have a series of other chapters that made it through into some academic books, all in the field of Jonathan Edwards, which is my academic specialty aside from my pastoral ministry roles. And I was surfing that wave, cresting the wave, and I put together a book proposal for a new project on Edwards's miscellanies. His resolutions. Miscellanies is another project. I wanted to do a book on Edwards's resolutions, his 70 resolutions that he wrote as a young man to guide his life trajectory and his character and the kind of person that he wanted to be. And so I put this together in a book proposal, and I sent it off, and every indication was that this thing was going to work. I sent it to one of the top 5 Christian publishers in America. Amazing publisher, super high respect for them. They have conferences, and they're in every Christian bookstore and radio stuff, and it looked like it was going to go. It looked like it was going to go through. It made it through the first editor, and then they took it to the next level, and every indication was that this week I was going to get a good response. At least that's how I was interpreting our communications. Well, it turns out I got a rejection letter, and believe me, this is not my first rejection letter that I've ever experienced as a writer. If you're going to write, man, it takes so much perseverance to keep on going. And there's a sense in which when you have a piece rejected, it's like, it just stabs you in the heart, because writing is so much of the pouring out of the soul. And you put so much into your writing, the creative process, the passion, the blood, the sweat, the tears. And I thought this was going to go, and it did not. And so I called my wife, and I said, "You're not going to believe this. The piece got rejected." And so here I am, back to stage one, back to the drawing board. Nothing to look forward to. And it is a disappointment, I will admit that. However, knowing what I know about Jonathan Edwards, he too had professional setbacks in his career, the greatest of which was when his church fired him. Jonathan Edwards, America's greatest theologian, was fired by the Church of Northampton related to a controversy in 1950 of communion or the Lord's Supper and who should be admitted to the supper. And he lost a job. He was voted out. 23 years he served the Church of Northampton faithfully as their pastor, and they voted him out, not just by a majority, but by a large majority. The people rejected him, and he was rejected professionally. Well, what happened to Jonathan Edwards is he had few opportunities, a couple in Scotland. Not much was opening up in the colonies. And so Edwards took a job which by all accounts would be considered a demotion. He accepted a calling to the Stockbridge missionary community, which is on the frontier, a dangerous place, on the edge of the wild, so to speak, and he had to serve a much smaller congregation, including some English and quite a few of the First Nations people, or the Native Americans as they're variously called, the Indians, the Indians of Stockbridge, of the Mohican tribe. By all means, by all accounts, professionally, if we looked at this from a business level, Edwards got fired and accepted a demotion. However, from the spiritual perspective, things are different. And it was during that time in Stockbridge where Edwards actually wrote some of his best works, some of the most important pieces that he ever wrote. His work on freedom of the will, his work on the nature of true virtue, his philosophical piece, his masterpiece on the doctrine of original sin. These all came out of that very difficult period in his life when he'd been fired, and yet it foisted him into greatness as a philosopher, a theologian, and even as a pastor. Some people say that his best sermons were to the Indians of Stockbridge because they were simpler and clearer, and he could speak from the heart rather than have to do the highly artificial, that's not the right word, the high artifice of the sermons that he had preached in Northampton, which required a rigorous level of skill and precision. Well, it freed him up. It freed Edwards up to do the things that God was really calling him to do, which was these incredible works of theology and philosophy. And it wouldn't have happened unless he got fired. So we can look at these experiences and trials of some of the saints that have gone before us, and we can say, yes, so maybe my peace got rejected. So maybe I accepted demotion. Maybe my career is not going as well as I would want it to from a human, superficial level. And yet there's a great sense which all these things fall in the sovereignty of God as well. And we don't know what's going to come. Maybe there's a different publisher that will accept this proposal. Maybe one that's better. It's hard to imagine that, but maybe there's one that will better suit the purposes of God's people. And for this reason, we trust and we hope. But I will say this, if you have experienced some professional disappointment, you pick yourself up, you put on your best suit the next day, and you go back to work or die trying. Your work is to get a job if you lose your job. I remember one time I had a meeting that went terrible. This was a while back, and I felt so bad about how the meeting had gone the night before. I didn't even want to be a pastor the next day. Well, what I did, instead of moping or groaning or crying or quitting, is I got up early, a little bit earlier than normal. I put on the very best suit that I have. Didn't even have any meetings that day. I put on my best suit and I went back to work, and you just keep going. You just keep going. Perseverance.